Hello, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Ngqabutho Moyo, a mixed methods researcher and educator who recently earned his PhD in Management Complex Systems from University of California, Merced. We will be discussing his PhD research, which focused on the critical tipping point between eustress and psychological distress at work, particularly on frontline healthcare workers. Ngqabutho, it's pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure indeed meeting you, and thank you so much for having me.
Can you just tell me, like, why were you interested in this topic of stress?
Okay, so my interest actually came especially during the time of COVID-19,
Hmm.
looking at how, the frontline healthcare workers, were working, they were saving lives, they were at the forefront, they were caring for people affected, by the pandemic. But my question was, who cares for these carers? You know,
Hmm.
who is
Hmm.
there to investigate what
Hmm.
they are going through, their
Yeah.
challenges,
Yeah.
and how those challenges are affecting them,
Yeah.
their well-being, psychological well-being, and their
Yeah.
performance at work. And because I'm an
Hmm.
HR person or I'm an OB person,
Okay.
I had to focus on their performance outcomes.
Okay. Who are these frontline workers?
So I basically focused, on the frontline workers at the forefront, being the registered nurses,
Okay.
the LPNs,
Hmm.
the caregivers, because
Hmm.
they are at the forefront.
Yeah.
They are
Right.
dealing with all these challenges,
Yeah.
looking after patients. We
Hmm.
have got, different conditions, they are experiencing different kinds of
Yeah.
stresses, or let me say stressors, for instance, like the time pressure, the workload, the work
Yeah.
complexity, so etc. etc. So I basically focused on these frontline healthcare service workers at the forefront, dealing directly with the patients.
Ngqabutho, your research centers on an idea many people find fascinating that stress can be positive. Can you first explain the distinction between a stressor and stress?
Oh, thank you so much for asking, such an important question. So what I can say is that a stressor can be understood as a challenging or hindering event
Hmm.
that can trigger stress
Hmm.
and can drain the person's emotional,
Hmm.
physical, and mental energy, thereby, increasing stress levels.
Hmm. How do you formally define the difference between eustress and psychological distress?
Okay, what I can say is we must have, first of all understand, that eustress and psychological distress are two types of occupational stress,
Hmm.
affecting workers, at the
Hmm.
workplace. And
Hmm.
they can be defined and differentiated based on how a person responds to a stressor. So I'm going to
Hmm.
start with eustress.
Hmm.
Eustress, for instance, can be understood as a positive psychological response or reaction to a stressor that is evaluated as healthy, functional, and positive, and as challenging rather than hindering. Whereas psychological distress can be understood basically as a negative psychological response to stressors that are evaluated as unhealthy, dysfunctional, and hindering rather than challenging.
Ngqabutho, what initially sparked your interest in the relationship between these two types of stress?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, so what I can say is my interest, was sparked by seeing how,
Mm,
the same stressor can lead
mm,
to either positive or
mm,
negative stress, or to either growth or
mm,
harm,
mm,
depending on how it is
mm,
perceived, on how it is evaluated or
mm,
praised.
mm,
This therefore highlighted the need for me to
mm,
understand, the
mm.
tipping point between these two types,
Ah,
of stress, namely eustress and psychological distress.
ah. So I want to focus on this tipping point. What brought you to focus on this tipping point concept for your PhD research?
Okay, so I focused on this tipping point because I wanted, to understand if it was possible at all, how and when eustress, can turn into negative stress called
Okay.
psychological distress,
Mm,
and to see whether
mm,
psychological distress,
mm,
can shift back into
mm.
positive stress called eustress,
Okay.
based on many things. For instance,
Yeah.
if it was reappraised,
Mm,
So
yeah.
that's basically, what brought me into this kind of research that I'm working on.
So would you mind walking us through your theoretical model, the tipping point model?
Okay, so I'm just gonna try to explain this model. Like I'm just gonna be try to shorten, my
Mm,
explanation.
yeah.
However, so what I'm looking at is
Yeah.
I'm simply saying that there are different stressors,
Mm,
workers are experiencing at their
mm,
workplace, right?
okay.
And these stressors um, can either result in eustress or psychological distress, depending on how individuals, interpret them, or praise them, or let me say, evaluate them. This is this process of evaluation. We call it, the stress response.
Mm,
So, for instance, if a stressor is appraised
mm,
as a challenge,
mm,
it is actually
mm,
looked or perceived as functional, as positive, as healthy, and it gets linked to
yeah.
positive stress called eustress. However, when it is appraised, um, as a hindrance, it is actually defined or interpreted, as negative, as dysfunctional, as unhealthy, and therefore it gets linked, to psychological distress. And,
Mm,
given this stress response, I also introduced what we call a growth mindset, because
mm,
I noticed that a growth mindset
mm,
also influences how individuals,
mm,
respond to a
mm,
stress. And as I said,
mm,
there are different stressors
mm,
that I looked at, which I'm going to talk about, as we go on.
oh,
So, for instance, individuals with a high growth mindset, I
mm,
like to evaluate a stressor from the positive perspective. For
mm,
instance, they're likely to evaluate a stressor as positive, functional, and
mm,
healthy, and
mm,
therefore link it with
mm,
eustress. Whereas those with a low growth mindset, they're likely to
yeah.
view a stressor
Yeah.
from the negative
Yeah.
perspective, and therefore look at it as negative and dysfunctional, and
Mm,
therefore associate it with psychological distress.
yeah. So, how does an employee evaluate a single workplace stressor?
Okay, so what I can say is an employee relies on what we call cognitive evaluation, to determine if a stressor is positive
Uh-huh.
and, functional, linking it to eustress, or if it is negative and dysfunctional, and therefore associating it with psychological distress.
Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Nice. So, what are the psychological processes that lead it to develop into either motivating eustress or deliberating distress?
Thank you for asking that important question, Professor David Dobson. So, what I can say is it all depends on how a person perceives and evaluates, a stressor. For instance, if they see a stressor as a challenge they can handle, their fight response, gets triggered.
Okay.
And as it gets triggered, their engagement with this type of a stressor also gets, triggered, leading to what we call eustress, which is positive stress.
Mm,
They become more motivated, to approach this kind of a stressor
mm,
simply because it is perceived or evaluated, as positive and as associated with growth.
mm,
So that's basically what motivates them on that particular side. But if they see it, or let me say, if they see a stressor as a threat or as a hindrance, they
mm,
find it, overwhelming. And when this happens, their flight response gets triggered.
mm,
And their disengagement with this type of a stressor is also triggered because it is linked, to psychological distress, which is negative and dysfunctional. Yeah,
mm,
so basically that is how,
mm.
they respond to a stressor.
So I want to talk a little bit about your research findings. Your findings consistently supported a strong link between psychological distress and negative outcomes, how significantly does this type of distress impact an employee's performance outcomes and the intent to turnover?
Okay, let's start from here. Because it is negative,
Yeah.
hindering, and overwhelming. Psychological distress has negative implications
Mm,
for employee performance
mm,
outcomes.
mm,
And it often leads to turnover intentions
mm,
simply because of how,
mm,
its cause or its root causes, are
mm,
evaluated and their associations with the negative, attributes,
mm,
such
mm,
as um, being negative, being
mm,
unhealthy, being
mm,
dysfunctional. It,
mm,
it is often associated with
mm,
anxiety, with
mm,
burnout, and with all that.
mm,
As a result,
mm,
we get into a situation whereby
mm.
employees, end up opting for, turnover intentions. Based on the interviews that I conducted,
Yeah.
like even if
Mm,
the frontline healthcare workers were
mm,
complaining about
mm, mm,
these stressors, these hindering stressors
mm,
which are associated with psychological distress, what
mm,
they indicated was like, we do not have a choice.
mm,
At the end of the day, we have to approach them, because
mm,
this is part of our job.
mm,
So maybe their moral
mm,
obligations and
mm,
their ethical obligations,
mm,
influence them to still approach
mm,
them, and maybe that also like influences their
mm,
reappraisals, the reappraisal
mm,
of these psychological,
mm,
distressors,
mm,
as maybe
mm,
some things that can be
mm,
dealt with or things that can be managed such
mm,
that we can continue working, even if,
mm.
we would love, to leave these workplaces.
Right. Nabuto, on the flip side, what impact did your research suggest Eustress has a positive organizational outcomes like employee engagement or overall well-being?
Okay, so I'm going to use the same approach because it
Yeah,
is positive.
yeah,
Now,
yeah,
challenging, functional, and associated, with growth.
yeah.
Eustress has positive effects on employee performance
Mm,
outcomes,
mm,
and it often leads, to what we call employee engagement.
mm,
Remember, because of its positive
mm,
um, attributes, and because of how its root causes, are praised and
mm,
evaluated as positive and functional.
nice. Uh, One of your most interesting non-findings, your research didn't support that finding, your hypothesis, was that a growth mindset did not significantly moderate the stressor and stress relationships. Okay, I want to ask you, why did you initially hypothesize this link?
Okay, so basically, I expected, a growth mindset to moderate, this relationship because
Mm,
theoretically, people with a high growth mindset, as I mentioned
mm,
earlier on,
mm,
usually view challenges as opportunities for growth.
mm,
Whereas those with a low growth mindset
mm.
may view hindrances, as dysfunctional and overwhelming, such
Yeah.
that it is hard for them to deal with them, right? Therefore, this leads to their flight response
Mm,
or avoidance coping.
mm,
So they disengage
mm,
from dealing, with
mm,
those kind of
mm,
stressors,
mm.
which then means that they are avoiding them. Yeah.
Okay. So, how does this unexpected result suggest about the limits of mindset interventions in high pressure work environments?
Oh, that's an important question. So what I can say is it suggests that mindset alone may not be enough to
Mm,
influence, the stress response in high pressure environments. There
mm,
are other things that may influence, the
mm,
stress response because growth mindset are simply a moderator. For
mm,
instance, we do have, other factors that may influence this stress response. For instance, the perceived
mm,
organizational support. If they do have that no perception that we know that our organization cares for us, we know that they do have that commitment to look after us, to treat us as the most valuable, people in
yeah,
this organization.
yeah.
If they do have that mentality, they
Yeah.
are likely, for instance, that's my own
Mm,
understanding. They are likely to evaluate, certain stressors as positive. from the
mm,
positive,
mm,
perspective rather than from the negative perspective. There are other, of course, factors that may also affect the stress response, which we may talk about. However, in this case, simply because I'm trying to explain about the growth mindset, we're going to focus on that one.
right. Yeah. Since your study focused heavily on frontline workers, uh, what were the most common and significant stressors you identify through your qualitative interviews?
Okay, so the most common and significant stressors that we identified, um, and which were framed as either challenges or hindrances, or challenge and hindrance stressors,
Mm,
included, stressors such as time pressure,
mm,
workload, work complexity, role conflict,
mm,
staff shortages,
mm,
patient
mm,
acuity. However, I for my research, for my survey research, I
mm,
mainly focused on the four stressors, which are time pressure, workload, work
mm.
complexity, and role conflict.
Right. And I know that after your qualitative interviews, you did the experimental research. So, how did these real world pressures you just discussed inform your experimental manipulation of time pressure?
Okay, so I based the manipulation on real world time pressure situations.
Yeah.
For instance, I focused on the high pressure environment
Mm,
where these frontline
mm,
healthcare workers are working.
mm,
So I created the low and high time pressure conditions that
mm,
they normally face,
mm,
on their day-to-day, basis.
mm,
Um, so if I can talk about how I created these conditions, uh, there are these national exams which are being
mm,
written by the registered nurses, by the caregivers,
mm,
by like all of these, frontline healthcare workers. So I
mm,
compiled a number of questions, from those exams. So in one condition, I had five questions which were supposed to be completed, in 15 minutes. That was the low time pressure condition.
mm,
And on the other side, I had 40 questions. Yeah, I think it was 40. Yeah, 40 questions which were supposed to be completed in 15 minutes, which
mm,
was the high time pressure condition. And
mm,
I timed these questions so that I could see, so that I could, like, individuals could be exposed, like the participants could be exposed to those time pressure conditions. So basically, those are the conditions that I created. Yeah, I assessed one, their performance as the manipulation checks their performance, assessed their performance on those questions. I also assessed the like with the completion rate, right, to see um like the number of questions that they completed. And again, I assist and I then assessed the self-reported time pressure as as a condition.
mm,
So in the form of of a measure of a measurement scale, like a survey
mm,
scale. That is what
mm.
I did. Those were my manipulation checks.
Nabuto, based on your research in developing effective strategies, what are your recommendations for people at all organizational levels, like individuals, teams, or leaders in high pressure sectors who want to reduce psychological distress and actively build resilience?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that question. So I basically recommend what I call a multi-level
Mm,
approach. For instance, at the individual level,
mm,
training employees to reframe stressors, as
mm,
opportunities for growth, and
mm,
again, boosting their sovereign skills,
mm,
by training them on how to
mm,
serve,
mm,
and again, using adaptive coping strategies can definitely, strengthen their resilience whenever they face, stressors. When
right.
we go now to at the team level, I encourage, um, peer support, for instance, and again,
Mm,
things like open communication, which I
mm,
believe they may create um, a psychologically safe environment where employees, are able to support each other, right?
yeah.
And when we go now to the leadership and organizational level, I would recommend supportive leadership and gain clear role expectations, establishing clear role expectations, and gain um, establishing, fair workload distribution and ensure adequate staffing, uh, and again, ensure flexible
Yeah,
scheduling,
yeah,
which I believe they can also reduce, stress,
yeah.
and they can therefore foster the well-being of workers. Yeah.
Mm, yeah. Uh, Nagabuto, to leave our listeners with actionable thought, if you could offer one piece of advice that an individual could implement today to shift their response toward building resilience, which is you call them eustress, rather than succumbing to a psychological distress, what would that be?
Important. Okay. So I would say people should learn to pause
Mm,
and reframe
mm,
a stressor.
mm,
They should take a moment, just to identify what's within your control and try to see at least every challenge as an opportunity for growth rather than to view every challenge, from the negative perspective
mm,
and therefore associate them with psychological distress.
mm,
So they should have that positive approach
mm,
to different challenges or
mm,
stressors that they
mm,
come across.
mm,
That will definitely help them to have
mm.
a positive evaluation.
Wonderful. Nagabuto, thank you for sharing your research on stress tipping point. We wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is an amazing opportunity. Like I got, to talk about my research